hastily called meeting took place in Riverrun's war room, its usually calm atmosphere replaced by an air of urgency. King Robert Baratheon sat at the head of the table, his broad frame tense, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief. Across from him, Eddard Stark leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together, his expression grave. "Dragons," Robert muttered, breaking the silence. His voice carried a weight that silenced even the bustling activity outside. "Bloody dragons, Ned, flying over the wall, burning the north. What in the seven hells is going on?" Ned Stark met his old friend's gaze, his own eyes shadowed by worry. "Reports are coming in from the wall and Castle Black. The fire to the north, the dragons, and this Varos is no coincidence, Robert. Something is stirring, something beyond our reckoning." Robert slammed his fist onto the table, causing the maps and markers to jump. "I thought dragons were dead. The Targaryen girl had a few, sure, but those were fledglings. Now we're hearing of beasts larger than Balerion, and some sorcerer riding them like he owns the realm." Ned's voice was calm but firm. "The wall is holding for now, but the Night's Watch has confirmed that the dragons were not attacking them. They burned an army of the dead to the north, thousands of whites. The wildlings are fleeing south. Robert, the wall may stand, but what lies beyond it won't wait forever." Robert leaned back, running a hand over his face. "Dead men, sorcerers, dragons. I thought I'd left the worst behind in the rebellion, Ned. And now this." Ned nodded, his tone heavy with resolve. "We have to act, Robert. The wall needs reinforcement, and if the dead truly march south, the north will be the first to fall. Winterfell is readying its bannermen, but it won't be enough." Robert leaned forward, his voice lowering but no less forceful. "And what of this Varos? What does he want? Why does he suddenly appear now, with dragons no less?" Ned hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "According to the reports, he's not an enemy, yet. He's warned the Night's Watch to open their gates to the wildlings, to prevent them from bolstering the Night King's army. If what he says is true, he's bought us time. But his methods are questionable." "Questionable?" Robert's voice rose. "He threatened to burn Castle Black to the ground if they didn't let the wildlings through. That's not a savior, Ned, that's a tyrant." "Perhaps," Ned admitted, his voice steady. "But he destroyed an army of whites, Robert, and his dragons are unlike anything we've ever seen. If his goal is truly to stop the Night King, then we may have no choice but to work with him." Robert's eyes burned with frustration, his hands gripping the edges of the table. "And what if he's lying? What if this is all some ploy to make himself king? You saw what the dragons did to Harrenhal centuries ago. If this Varos turns on us, there won't be a kingdom left to save." Ned met Robert's gaze, his voice firm. "If that happens, we'll face him. But right now, the dead are the greater threat. We need to rally the houses, prepare the wall, and ensure the living stand together. If we don't, none of this will matter." Robert exhaled deeply, his frustration simmering into reluctant agreement. "Fine. We'll send ravens to every corner of the realm. Call the banners. If the Night King is coming, we'll be ready for him." He stood abruptly, pacing the room. "But I'll say this, Ned. I don't trust sorcerers and I don't trust dragons. If Varos so much as looks at the south with ambition, he'll find me waiting with my hammer." Ned rose as well, placing a steady hand on Robert's shoulder. "We've fought wars together, Robert. We'll face this one too. But this is unlike anything we've ever seen. We need to stand united, or we won't stand at all." Robert nodded reluctantly, his mind already turning to the battles ahead. "Then let's pray this Varos knows what he's doing, because if he doesn't, we're all doomed." As the tension in the war room simmered, Robert Baratheon leaned heavily on the edge of the table, his brow furrowed in frustration. He shook his head, his disbelief evident. "White Walkers, Ned?" Robert said, his voice tinged with incredulity. "Next, you'll tell me the tales of the Long Night are true. Frozen demons and armies of the dead. It's all just a bloody legend. Stories to scare children. And now we're supposed to rally the realm against bedtime tales. Ned Stark's gaze was steady, his voice calm but firm. I thought the same once, Robert. But the wall has stood for thousands of years, not against men, but against something worse. Something we've forgotten. Robert scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. Forgotten? Or never existed? What proof do we have that these White Walkers are anything more than myths? Old Nan's stories and the ramblings of a few rangers from the Night's Watch? That's not enough to wage a war. Ned took a step closer, his tone growing sharper. The fire burning beyond the wall isn't a story, Robert. Varos's dragons burned thousands of whites. The Night's Watch has sent word that they've seen the dead marching. I don't need stories to know that something terrible is coming. The dead don't march without a reason. Robert slammed his fist onto the table, the sound echoing through the room. It still doesn't make sense, Ned. Why now? Why after all this time? If these White Walkers are real, where have they been for the last few thousand years? Ned's face darkened, his voice low. I don't know, but the old stories spoke of their return, of a long winter that would bring death to all living things. Maybe we grew complacent. Maybe we stopped believing because we thought we were safe. But we're not, Robert. Not anymore. Robert straightened, his eyes narrowing as he studied his old friend. And you believe this Varos? A man who appears out of nowhere with dragons and tales of an ancient enemy? You trust him? I don't trust him, Ned admitted. But I trust what I've seen. I trust the wall's warnings, and I trust the reports of the fires burning north. Robert, you know me. I don't give in to superstition. But this feels different. Real. For a long moment, Robert said nothing, his gaze fixed on the map spread across the table. The thought of White Walkers, of an army of the dead, clashed violently with everything he believed. He was a man of action, a man of steel and warhammers, not someone who bowed to myths and shadows. Finally, he exhaled deeply, his voice quieter. If they're real, if this Night King and his army are truly coming, then what do we do, Ned? How do you fight something you've only heard about in stories? Ned's voice was steady, though the weight of his words was clear. We fight as we always have, together. We call the banners. We prepare the wall. And we trust in whatever strength we can muster, even if that includes dragons and fire priests. Robert let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Bloody dragons and legends. It's like we're living in a tale told by drunkards in a tavern. He turned back to Ned, his expression hardening. Fine, we'll act. We'll prepare. But if these White Walkers are nothing more than shadows, then this Varos and his dragons had better stay far from the south. Because if they're playing games with me, I'll end them, legends or not. Ned placed a hand on Robert's shoulder, their bond unspoken but strong. If the stories are true, Robert, then we don't have time for grudges. The living must stand together, or we won't stand at all. Robert grunted in reluctant agreement, his mind clearly wrestling with the impossible reality before him. The weight of the realm's survival now hung heavily on both their shoulders, and for the first time in years, the king and his warden felt the chilling grip of fear. Robert leaned back in his chair, the weight of the discussion pressing heavily on him. He ran a hand over his face, letting out a frustrated sigh. His gaze turned to Ned, sharp and decisive. If these White Walkers are real, and the wall is in danger, we can't wait for them to knock on our gates, Robert said, his voice firm. We need men at the wall now. Men who can hold it and buy us time to rally the rest of the realm. Ned nodded, his face grave but understanding. The North can muster forces to support the Night's Watch, but we'll need more than just the Stark bannermen. The wall hasn't faced anything like this in thousands of years. Robert straightened, his eyes narrowing with determination. Then we'll send more than just northern men. The Knights of the Vale are one of the strongest forces in the realm. If we can get them to move, they'll hold the wall long enough for us to prepare for the larger fight. Ned raised an eyebrow, his tone cautious. The Vale is loyal to the crown, but Lisa Arryn is not one to act swiftly, especially when it comes to risking her forces. She may need persuasion. Robert's expression darkened, his patience clearly thin. Then let Stannis persuade her. He's already dealing with the Vale and he knows how to make people act one way or another. Send a raven to him. Tell him to move the knights of the Vale to the wall and to make sure they're ready to fight. Ned hesitated for a moment, then nodded. I'll send the raven immediately. But Robert, even with the Vale's forces, this will only delay the Night King. We need a long-term plan. Robert slammed his fist on the table, his voice rising. We'll plan, Ned. But first, we make sure the wall doesn't fall. If we lose the wall, there's nothing between us and the dead. Ned nodded again, his mind already working through the logistics of what needed to be done. I'll write to Stannis. If anyone can convince the Vale to move quickly, it's him. The wall will hold for now. Robert exhaled deeply, his anger simmering into resolve. Good. If Lisa hesitates, remind her what's at stake. She can't hide in the Eyrie forever. The fight's coming to all of us, and it's better to face it united than divided. As Ned rose to leave, Robert's voice softened slightly. And Ned, remind Stannis of this. He's a stubborn bastard, but he's one of the few men I trust to see this through. If we're to survive, we'll need his strength at the wall. Ned paused, nodding once before leaving the room to draft the message. The urgency of the moment pressed heavily on them both. The wall needed reinforcements, and the Knights of the Vale would be the first step in rallying the realm to face the unthinkable threat beyond the wall. As the meeting wore on, Robert poured himself another cup of wine, his movements deliberate as he tried to process the whirlwind of events unfolding across the realm. The glow of the fire in the hearth reflected in his eyes as he glanced at Ned, who sat across from him, his expression as serious as ever. Varos, Robert muttered, his voice heavy. Dragons, Valyria, and God's damned fire priests. I feel like we've stepped into one of old Nan's tales. What's his endgame, Ned? Nobody rides dragons like that without wanting something. Ned leaned forward, his fingers steepled as he weighed his words. Varos claims he wants to stop the Night King and the dead, and for now he's acted in line with those claims. His dragons have bought us time by burning the whites to the north, but his sudden appearance raises more questions than answers. If he comes from Valyria, then he carries the weight of a legacy long thought lost to the world. Valyria, Robert spat, his tone bitter. A cursed place, ruined by the greed of its dragon lords. And now this Varos claims to be their heir. You trust him? Ned shook his head. I don't trust him, Robert, but I can't ignore the power he wields. Dragons of that size, immune to the Night King's magic. If what the Watch says is true, he may be the only one capable of holding the dead at bay long enough for us to act. Robert slammed his cup down, the wine sloshing over the rim. And if he turns those dragons south, Ned? What then? I'll not see the Seven Kingdoms burned to ash because some Valyrian sorcerer decides he's owed a crown. That's a possibility, Ned admitted, his voice calm but firm. But right now, the dead are the greater threat. If we don't unite against them, there won't be a kingdom left to burn. Robert grunted, leaning back in his chair. And then there's this business with Jon Snow, your bastard off to Astapor of all places. What in the seven hells is he doing there? Ned's face hardened slightly at the mention of Jon. He's no longer a boy, Robert. He's a man, and a capable one at that. He's gone to Astapor to meet Daenerys Targaryen, to learn her intentions and assess whether she's an ally or a threat. Robert scowled, his grip tightening on his cup. Targaryens. I've had enough of them to last a lifetime. And you trust this girl? This daughter of the Mad King? You think she'll listen to your bastard? I don't trust her, Ned replied evenly. But I trust Jon. He's honorable and perceptive. If anyone can determine her motives, it's him. We can't afford to ignore her, Robert. Not with dragons at her command. Robert laughed bitterly, shaking his head. More dragons. As if Varos's beasts weren't enough to deal with. And you expect Jon to convince her to do what? March north and fight the dead? Or kneel before me, the usurper who took her father's throne? Ned met Robert's gaze steadily. I expect Jon to bring back the truth. Whether she's a threat or an ally, we need to know. And if she's willing to fight the dead, then perhaps we can find common ground." Robert's face darkened, his voice quieter but no less intense. "And if she's not? If she's just another Targaryen with dreams of fire and blood? Then we'll face her too," Ned said simply. "But not until the dead are dealt with. One war at a time, Robert." The room fell into a heavy silence as the two men considered the weight of the decisions before them. The threat from the north, the resurgence of Valyrian power, and the re-emergence of Targaryen dragons all hung over them like a gathering storm. Finally, Robert exhaled deeply, breaking the silence. "So, dragons to the north, dragons in the east, and armies of the dead in between. You're asking me to trust the word of a Valyrian sorcerer and a bastard on a mission to meet a Targaryen queen." Ned allowed a faint, humorless smile. "Stranger things have happened, Robert." Robert barked a short laugh, though it carried little mirth. "Aye, and they all seem to be happening now. Fine, send your ravens, call your banners, and let Jon Snow do his part. But mark my words, Ned. If these dragons so much as glance at the Iron Throne, I'll remind them what steel and fire feel like." Ned nodded, knowing the truth of Robert's words. The storms gathering across Westeros and beyond were unlike any they had ever faced. The only certainty was that the choices they made in the coming days would shape the fate of the realm.